Hey, where? Okay then. Chapter 6. When your partner walks out. Christians shouldn't cause divorce, but sometimes they have to accept it. Most of Paul's teaching on marriage and divorce is found in his first letter to the Corinthian church, written about AD 55. Corinth was a major cosmopolitan city and was largely made up of Gentiles, though there were also a lot of Jews in the city and in the young church. They were having problems applying Jesus' teaching in a city that followed the Roman legal system. To complicate things further, Corinth was in the grip of a terrible famine which made any kind of family life difficult. Paul did not disapprove of marriage. It is almost certain that Paul had been married when he was younger, though we know that he was single when he wrote 1 Corinthians. Marriage was compulsory for a pious Jew, and Paul said that before his conversion he was a very religious Pharisee. Acts 23:6 and Philemon 3:5. Every Jewish male was expected to marry in order to fulfill God's command to multiply and fill the earth, Genesis 1:28. It was unthinkable that a pious young man would remain single. Paul's wife had probably died in childbirth, as happened all too often in the first century. We can surmise that he knew about marriage personally, its joys, responsibilities, and sadness. As well as being compulsory for Jews, marriage was compulsory in Roman law, though it was rarely enforced. This law had been enacted by the Emperor Augustus, who saw that most Roman young men avoided marriage and fatherhood so they could enjoy an endless series of affairs. He was worried by the lack of legal sons born into Roman households and by the weakening of the family unit. So in 18 BC, he introduced laws that made it compulsory to get married. Paul contradicted both the Jewish and the Roman law by teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 that marriage is optional. Corinth, being a Roman city, followed Roman law, and many members of its church were former Jews, so they also knew about Jewish law. Paul therefore had a tough job to convince them that if they were not already married, they should not get married, at least not yet. Many people think this teaching means that Paul was against marriage, but he was only telling the Corinthians to wait until the present distress, 1 Corinthians 7:26, was over. He did not need to tell them what kind of distress this was because their suffering was all too obvious to them. Historians guess that he must have been referring to the famine that was afflicting the region at that time. In the first century, getting married meant having children, and it is not easy to care for babies and toddlers in a time of famine. A question about sex. In general, Paul approved of marriage, but there were some Christians in Corinth who were against marriage, and who wrote to Paul to ask him if he agreed. Paul quotes a phrase from their letter that encapsulates their viewpoint. Now, concerning the matter about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. With that part in quotes. 1 Corinthians 7:1. One English translation unfortunately says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to marry," with no quotes, so that it looks as if Paul is making this statement himself and that he is against marriage. These are actually the words of some Corinthians who wanted to avoid sex. They thought that they could live holier lives if they avoided women, and one woman had evidently already left her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:10-11. Paul replies by reminding the Corinthian Christians what their marriage vows are. They promise to feed, clothe, and share conjugal love with their spouse. And Paul emphasizes that if they neglect conjugal love, they are depriving their partner. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another. 1 Corinthians 7:3-4. Notice that Paul does not say that either partner can demand sexual love, because both should regard the other person as ruling over their body. Love is a matter of not of taking, but of giving. Paul is almost using the language of slavery, saying they should both consider themselves to belong to the other. He has probably been influenced here by the context of the verse on which the marriage vows were based, the law about the rights of the slave wife in Exodus 21:10-11. Also, Paul does not define what this love consists of, because in some situations a cuddle is a warmer expression of conjugal love than intercourse. Paul says that each should be concerned for the needs and wishes of their partner and not for themselves. The couple could, of course, take a break from sexual relations, and Paul recognizes that this is sometimes a good thing if it makes extra time for prayer. But he also warns them that this should not be done for long in case their abstinence led to sin. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. 1 Corinthians 7:5. This is very similar to the types of rules that rabbis made about conjugal rights. The rabbis also allowed such breaks and defined exactly how long they could be. For instance, you were allowed a longer break if your work took you away from home, and an even longer break if you were a rabbi, but you got no break at all if you were unemployed. Paul does not make legalistic definitions like these, but just says that a couple may take a short break for prayer. Caring for each other. Paul reminds the Corinthians about their marriage vows by using language and ideas that would have been familiar to them from their Jewish background. Non-Jews would have found these concepts familiar as well, because Greek marriage contracts at the time also spoke of providing food and clothing, though most of them avoided mentioning conjugal love. With regard to the vows to feed and clothe each other, Paul summarizes these obligations in a single category that we might call material support. Similarly, the rabbis had various regulations concerning the neglect of physical affection and of material support. They defined exactly how much the man had to spend on food and cloth, and how much cooking and sewing the woman had to do. Paul, however, does not specify quantities and simply says that spouses must please each other. Quote, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:32-34. Paul sounds rather negative about marriage here, but as noted earlier, this was probably due to the famine. It was a difficult time to be married because it was difficult to keep the vows to provide food and clothes and general material care for each other. Yet Scripture said that if a husband or wife willfully failed to provide food and clothing, they were guilty of neglect. Although Scripture did not specifically mention abuse, this was implied in the law against neglect. If a husband was not allowed to starve his wife or refuse her money for clothes, then he certainly could not beat his wife or rape or imprison her. Similarly, if a wife could not refuse to cook or sew for her husband, she certainly could not beat or poison or torture him. Roman divorce was too easy. If anyone did do any of these things, there was an easy remedy. Their partner could divorce them immediately and without any difficulty using Roman divorce by separation. This was possible because Corinth was run under Roman law, and even Jews could choose to use a Roman divorce if they wished. This Roman divorce was very easy. All you had to do was walk out of your house if your partner owned it, or tell your partner to get packing and leave the house if you owned it. There was no need to cite any grounds for ending the marriage, and having separated, you were both legally divorced and free to remarry. For a victim of an abusive marriage, it was good that under Roman law they could get away from their partner without too much difficulty, since they did not have to prove the abuse in court. But the problem was that divorce in Corinth was too easy. You do not need any good reason to get divorced, or in fact any reason at all. You could walk out on an innocent and loving partner, or you could even throw them out of the house if you owned it. Either partner could decide at any time to end the marriage, and the other partner became a helpless victim of this whim. Even Christians in Corinth were using the Roman method of divorce by separation. Having separated from their partners, they considered themselves divorced and free to remarry, and under Roman law they were. Paul had to remind them of the law of the Old Testament, pointing out that biblical divorce was always based on the grounds of broken vows, unlike the Roman groundless divorce. Therefore, Christians should not practice the Roman divorce by separation. They should not simply separate from their partner and consider themselves legally divorced. Quote, "To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not dismiss his wife." 1 Corinthians 7:10. Translating separate. These verses are translated in various ways in different Bibles, but it is important to translate them as literally as possible, especially concerning the way in which the separation occurs. Paul pictures both the husband and the wife deciding for themselves to divorce. She separates herself, that is, she walks out on him. He decides to dismiss his wife, that is, send her packing. The differences lie in the fact that the husband was the one most likely to own the house. So for the wife to divorce her husband, she would have to leave the house, that is, separate herself. While for the husband to divorce his wife, he would have to tell her to leave his house, that is, dismiss her. In this situation, Paul is not talking to partners who were divorced against their will, since both the man and the woman in these verses make their own decision to separate from their partner. If you want the technical details of the translation, here they are, but you can ignore them and skip ahead if you prefer. Paul uses separate in the reflexive mood, i.e. separate themselves, but this Greek form is exactly like the passive mood, be separated. This has confused a lot of translators, but in 1 Corinthians 7:15, Paul uses the same word again, with exactly the same form, in a context where it cannot possibly be passive and must be reflexive. Quote, "If the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so." In effect, he is saying if an unbeliever leaves a believer, let them do so, because after all, there is very little the believer can do about it. Now, if separate were translated in verse 15 with the passive rather than the reflexive, it would be if the unbelieving partner is separated, let it be so. In other words, any believer can leave an unbelieving spouse, and if they do, we should do nothing about it and just let it happen. This is patently the wrong translation because it is exactly the opposite of what Paul had already said in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11. Therefore, the correct translation is separate themselves. To leave the technicalities behind, Paul's point is that Christians should not use this Roman form of divorce by separation because it is groundless. Therefore, it is too easy to divorce people against their will when they have done nothing wrong. Anybody could take it on themselves to separate, and their partner would suddenly find they had been legally divorced, whether they wanted it or not. For Christians, this is simply not an option. What if you have used divorce by separation? But some Christians had already used divorce by separation, and Paul was keen to tell them what to do in that situation. If she does separate herself, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. 1 Corinthians 7:11. He is saying that if someone has separated, they should not consider themselves to be divorced, but should try to reverse the separation by remaining unmarried while trying to be reconciled again. In other words, they should do all they can to reverse the Roman divorce by separation. Paul was probably thinking of a particular woman at this point because he says she. But in the rest of this chapter, he was always careful to address both men and women, even to the point of repeating himself in an almost tiresome way. The Corinthians presumably knew which woman Paul was referring to, but we can only guess the reasons she separated from her husband. The only clue we have is in 1 Corinthians 7:1, where Paul quotes the Corinthians letter asking him about the teaching of some groups that had taught holiness included avoiding sex. quote, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman," and vice versa. The woman was probably influenced by one such group, but as we saw above, Paul certainly did not regard this as a biblical reason for divorce. Paul points out that Jesus himself condemned this type of groundless divorce because he rejected the Jewish groundless divorce, the any-cause divorce. The only difference in the Roman groundless divorce was that women as well as men could initiate it. Paul assumed that if Jesus condemned the Jewish groundless divorce, then he would condemn the Roman one. This is why Paul tells the Corinthians that the Lord commands them not to separate. 1 Corinthians 7:10. What if you are a victim of divorce by separation? So what about the victim of a divorce by separation? Paul has told the person who enacted the separation that they should remain unmarried and try to effect a reconciliation. But what if you had been forced into a divorce by your partner even though you did not want to split up? Paul addresses this situation in 1 Corinthians 7:15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. In effect, he says that if a non-Christian divorces you, you should let him or her go. This seems like a sudden U-turn, as if Paul does not care, and as though he does not want marriages between Christians and non-Christians to last. But we know this is not true, since he said the opposite in 1 Corinthians 7:12-13, where he tells Christians not to divorce their non-Christian partner. Quote, "If any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not dismiss her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not dismiss him." So Paul does not want Christians to divorce their non-Christian partners, and yet he says that Christians should let non-Christians divorce them. This does not seem to make sense until we look at it pragmatically. Ask yourself, what can the divorced Christian partner do? Their non-Christian husband or wife has told them the marriage is over. The husband has dismissed his wife or the wife has walked out. What can Paul tell the Christian to do to reverse this divorce? Of course, they should have been doing their utmost to hold the marriage together before the divorce, but once it has happened, any attempts at reconciliation are unlikely to work, and are likely to be seen as pestering. Paul teaches that once such a divorce has happened, a line should be drawn under it. He says, in effect, if they divorce you, there is not much you can do. If the actual divorce by separation has happened, then let them go. He then adds that God has called us to peace, and not to endless conflict after a divorce. Conclusion, divorce should be the last option. Paul and Jesus have the same message for two different cultures. 1. Believers should never cause a divorce. That is, they should not break their marriage vows. 2. Believers should not use a groundless divorce. Jewish believers should not use the Hillelite any-cause divorce, and no one should use the Roman divorce by separation. Jesus adds that believers should do all they can to save a marriage, which includes forgiving a partner who breaks vows and then repents. And Paul adds that believers who have wrongly enacted a divorce by separation should attempt to be reconciled and not remarry because that would make the divorce irreversible. Paul says further that if someone is divorced against their will, they may accept it. There is nothing they can do to reverse the divorce, and God has called them to peace. But this leaves us with two questions. Can a believer divorce a partner who breaks their vows unrepentantly? And can a believer remarry after a divorce? These questions will be answered in following chapters, but first we have to ask a more fundamental question. Do marriages ever end in the sight of God?